During a summer night shift at a small gas station, I started getting calls from the same person every 20 or 30 minutes. At first I figured it was some bored guy messing around. Looking back, I think he was trying to find out whether anybody else was there with me. This happened when I was 20 and home from college for the summer. I worked overnight shifts at a gas station near a highway exit in western Pennsylvania. My shift was from 11 p.m. until 5 a.m. Most nights weren't very eventful. I remember it was sometime in July because we'd been dealing with a stretch of hot weather. Earlier that day, I'd met up with a friend from high school for lunch, then gone home and slept before work. By the time I left for my shift, it had cooled off a little. The station sat next to a restaurant that closed early, and there were woods behind part of the property. Overnight, it was usually just me in the store. The manager didn't come in until the morning. The first few hours were normal. Around midnight, the phone rang. A man asked what our gas prices were. I told him. Then he asked if we carried a certain cigarette brand. I checked and said we did. He thanked me and hung up. That wasn't unusual. People called with questions all the time. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same voice. This time he asked if we still had coffee available overnight. I told him yes. He said thanks and hung up. I didn't think much about it. But then the calls kept coming. Every 20 or 30 minutes, the same guy would call and ask about something different. Lottery tickets, energy drinks, store hours, whether we got much business overnight. Nothing he asked sounded strange by itself. After a while, it just became annoying. Sometime after 1 a.m, I noticed a dark sedan drive slowly through the parking lot. It didn't stop for gas. It didn't park. It just rolled through and left. A little later, I saw what looked like the same car again. I can't swear it was the exact same one, but it looked similar. Dark sedan, 4 doors. Again, it drove through and left. I figured the driver was lost or looking for somewhere else. Not long after that, a truck driver came in for coffee. While I was ringing him up, he looked toward the side windows. "That guy work here?" he asked. I looked up. "Who?" "By the dumpster." I walked over and looked outside. Nobody was there. I told him no. He just shrugged and headed out. I didn't really think about it again until later. Around 3 a.m, I was stocking shelves behind the counter. There was a monitor near the register that showed the security cameras. I happened to look up and saw somebody behind the building. The person was standing near the gravel area where employees usually took smoke breaks. I only caught a quick look before he moved out of view. I stepped closer to the monitor. Nothing. The area was empty again. I thought about going outside to check, but I decided not to. People cut across the property sometimes. It didn't seem worth worrying about. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Same voice. "Still busy there?" he asked. Not really. The store had been empty for a bit. Then he asked another question. "You're there by yourself tonight, right?" I didn't answer right away. Before I could say anything, he hung up. That was the first call that stood out to me. Up until then, I had mostly written the whole thing off as somebody being weird. After that, I started paying more attention. I looked out the front windows. Nothing. I checked the cameras. Nothing. Everything looked normal. A few customers came through over the next hour. Then things slowed down again. Around 4, I noticed a dark sedan parked behind the restaurant next door. I hadn't seen it pull in. It was just sitting there. The lights were off. I looked at it for a few seconds, then went back to what I was doing. A couple minutes later, I checked the cameras again. There was somebody near the employee entrance on the side of the building. The image wasn't very clear, but there was definitely a person standing there. I watched for a few seconds. Then I called the police. I explained the phone calls, the person behind the building earlier, and what I was seeing on the cameras. An officer got there pretty quickly. While he was checking around outside, another patrol car arrived. The officers spent a while searching around the station and behind the restaurant. Eventually, one of them came inside and talked to me. They found footprints behind the building. More importantly, they found fresh pry marks on the rear employee door. Somebody had been trying to force it open. The officers searched the nearby woods and parking lots, but they never found anyone. The sedan was gone too. I never saw it leave. One officer stayed parked outside until my shift ended. Nothing else happened that morning. A few weeks later, management installed more cameras and stopped scheduling people to work overnight completely alone. As far as I know, nobody was ever identified. Maybe the caller and the guy outside were the same person. Maybe they weren't. The thing that sticks with me is how the calls always seemed to come when the store had just emptied out. The question about me being alone came after I hadn't seen a customer for a while. Maybe it was coincidence. I don't know. But if somebody was watching the station from nearby, it would explain a lot. I've always thought that was probably what was happening. For a little over a year, I worked overnight security at an office building outside Minneapolis. Most of the businesses in the building were pretty typical office tenants. Insurance companies, accounting firms, stuff like that. By midnight, everybody was gone. My shift was midnight to 8 in the morning. The building had 4 floors. The first 3 were occupied. The 4th floor had been mostly empty for months after a company moved out. At least that's what everyone told me. Most nights were pretty repetitive. I'd walk the building, check doors, look at camera feeds, and help maintenance if they needed something. I remember this happening in late October because it was starting to get cold. I grabbed a burger on the way to work one night and listened to part of a football game on the radio during the drive. Nothing unusual was going on. Around 1 in the morning, I did a patrol of the building. When I got to the 4th floor, I noticed a light on inside one of the vacant offices. I figured somebody had forgotten to turn it off. I shut it off and kept walking. The next night, another office light was on. Not the same office, a different one. I turned that one off too. A few days later, I mentioned it to maintenance. They thought it might be a timer issue. That sounded reasonable enough. Maybe a week later, I found something else. There was a break room near the middle of the 4th floor that nobody used anymore. One night, I noticed an empty bottle and a couple candy wrappers in the trash. The bottle still had condensation on it. I remember noticing that because it looked recent. The cleaning crew hadn't been through yet. I checked the nearby offices and didn't find anybody. I figured a contractor or maintenance worker had been up there earlier. That seemed like the most likely explanation. Not long after that, I started noticing something odd with the elevator. Part of my job was reviewing activity logs. A few times I saw that the elevator had stopped on the 4th floor overnight. Nobody had signed in. Nobody had badged into the building. The elevator would stop there for a minute or so and then continue. I asked maintenance about it. They said elevators sometimes do weird things. I accepted that answer at the time. A few nights later, I found a chair sitting in the middle of a hallway. It was a conference room chair. I stopped because I had walked through that same area earlier. I'm sure it hadn't been there. The fourth floor was mostly empty except for a few leftover pieces of furniture waiting to be removed. I rolled the chair back into the conference room and moved on. I didn't report it. It was a chair. I figured there was probably some explanation. Around that point, I started paying a little more attention when I went upstairs. Then there was the camera issue. One hallway camera on the east side of the fourth floor kept losing signal. It usually happened sometime after 2:30 in the morning. The feed would disappear for a few minutes and then come back. Maintenance checked it more than once. They couldn't find anything wrong with it. The thing I noticed was that it kept happening around the same time. Maybe it was a coincidence. I don't know. But it happened often enough that I started expecting it. By then, I'd seen enough little things that I was curious about what was going on. One night around 3 in the morning, I went up for another patrol. Everything looked normal. Most of the lights were off. I got about halfway down the main hallway when I heard a door close somewhere ahead of me. Not a loud slam, just a door shutting. I stopped and listened. Nothing. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds. Then I kept walking. I checked several offices. Nobody. I checked the conference rooms. Nobody. As I got closer to the back part of the floor, I noticed a storage room door that was slightly open. I'd walked past that room plenty of times before. The door was almost always closed. I walked over and pulled it open. At first I thought maintenance was storing supplies in there. Then I looked around. There were blankets folded against the wall, cases of bottled water, food containers, a flashlight, a duffel bag, several changes of clothes. It didn't take much guessing to figure out somebody had been using the room. It wasn't set up like someone had stopped there for a night. It looked more established than that. I backed out of the room and called my supervisor on the radio. Then I called the police. While I was waiting by the elevator, I heard another door shut somewhere in the building. I couldn't tell where it came from. Maybe a stairwell. Maybe another floor. I'm honestly not sure. When the officers arrived, they searched the fourth floor first. Then they checked the rest of the building. They didn't find anyone. The room was exactly how I'd left it. The blankets and other belongings were still there. From what I heard afterward, police believed somebody had been living in the vacant part of the building. The blankets, food, and clothes pointed pretty strongly in that direction. The lights made a little more sense after that. So did the trash. Even the chair. At least some of it. What I never understood was how the person managed to stay hidden for so long. There were cameras. I walked the building every hour. Most access points required key cards. Still, nobody was ever identified. A few weeks later, I was transferred to a different property. Nobody ever said it was connected to what happened. Maybe it wasn't. As far as I know, police never found whoever had been staying there. The thing I still think about is how they always seem to stay one step ahead. My patrols happened at roughly the same times every night. The camera outage happened around the same time, too. And the storage room wasn't far from an area where someone probably could have heard the elevator arriving. Maybe they learned my routine. Maybe they were watching from somewhere I never checked. I don't know. But if somebody was up there for weeks or months, they must have gotten pretty familiar with how the building worked. That's the part I've never been able to explain. When I started working night registration at a small hospital in eastern Kentucky, most of the stories people told were about patients. Drunk people showing up in the middle of the night, arguments in the waiting room, things like that. Nobody ever talked about somebody already being inside the building. I was 24 and had been working registration for maybe 6 months. My shift usually started around 1 in the morning and ended at 6. Overnight, there weren't many people around. Usually it was me, a nurse, a doctor, and a handful of other employees spread throughout the hospital. The hospital wasn't very big. Parts of it had been updated over the years, but there were still sections that weren't being used. One wing on the second floor had been closed for as long as I could remember. I never knew exactly why. I heard there had been plans to renovate it at some point, but I don't know if that was actually true. Some nights the place felt pretty empty. This all happened during the winter. I remember scraping snow off my windshield after work more than once around that time. At first, none of the things that happened seemed related. People started noticing food going missing from the employee break room. A soda would disappear. Someone's crackers would be gone. Stuff like that. Nobody made a big deal out of it. There were a lot of employees coming and going, and most people assumed somebody was helping themselves to whatever was in the refrigerator. A few weeks later, one of the nurses mentioned that a restricted hallway door had been found unlocked during the morning shift. The hallway led toward the closed wing. Maintenance locked it again. Nobody seemed too concerned. Around the same time, I overheard a couple nurses talking at the registration desk. One of them said she'd seen a guy near the elevators during an overnight shift. Not a patient, not somebody she knew. Just a guy in dark clothes walking toward an employee hallway. She figured he worked maintenance. Maintenance people were sometimes around at odd hours, so that explanation made enough sense. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds, and everyone moved on. A little later, I heard security discussing door alarm records with a supervisor. Apparently, one of the restricted access doors had been opened overnight. The strange part was that there wasn't a badge scan attached to it. I didn't hear all of it. From what I gathered, they thought the system had probably messed up. That seemed believable enough. Hospitals have equipment problems all the time. Then, people started noticing personal items getting moved around. Nothing major. A jacket would be somewhere different than where someone remembered leaving it. A backpack would end up in another chair. A clipboard would turn up in the wrong department. Nobody reported anything stolen. Nothing was damaged. It was just weird enough that people talked about it. One nurse joked that the hospital was haunted. Nobody seriously thought that. Most people blamed exhaustion. Long overnight shifts can make you forget where you left things. For a while, I thought that was probably all it was. Then one morning a nurse asked me to pick up some paperwork from a storage area connected to the closed wing. I'd been up there before. I grabbed a key and headed upstairs. The hospital was pretty quiet. The emergency department had been slow all night. As I got closer to the closed section, I noticed light coming from underneath a door farther down the hallway. I stopped for a second. That room wasn't supposed to be in use. The entire wing had been closed for months. I assumed maintenance might be working in there. That seemed like the obvious explanation. I kept walking. The door wasn't fully shut. When I got close enough to look inside, I could tell right away somebody had been spending time there. There were blankets stacked against the wall, food wrappers on a table, bottled water, a flashlight, a duffel bag, some clothes. It looked less like storage and more like somebody's temporary living space. I stood there for a few seconds trying to make sense of it. Then I heard a door shut somewhere farther down the hallway. Not a loud slam, just a door closing. I backed away from the room. I wasn't interested in finding out who might be nearby. I turned around and went straight back toward the nurse's station. I told the charge nurse what I'd found. Security was called. Then police were called. Officers showed up and started searching the building. At first, they didn't find anyone. The room was still there exactly as I'd seen it. The blankets, food, and everything else were untouched. Police kept searching. They checked maintenance areas, storage rooms, and utility spaces. Eventually, they found a man hiding in an unused maintenance area connected to the closed wing. I never saw him myself. I only heard about it afterward. From what we were told, he wasn't armed and didn't cause any problems when they found him. Investigators believed he'd been staying in unused parts of the hospital for a while. How long, nobody seemed to know. After that, a lot of the smaller things suddenly made more sense. The missing food, the unlocked doors, the reports of somebody walking through employee areas, even the personal items being moved around. At least some of it. Over the next few weeks, the hospital tightened security. Unused sections were locked down. Access procedures changed. People paid more attention to who belonged where. A few months later, I left for another job. As far as I know, nobody ever figured out exactly when that man first got inside the building. Some people thought it had only been a few weeks. Others thought it might have been months. I have no idea. The thing I still think about is how many chances there were to notice something was off. People saw things. Doors were opening. Food was disappearing. Stuff was being moved around. But every incident seemed small by itself. Everybody had a different explanation for each one. It wasn't until that room was found that anyone started connecting them together. And honestly, if I hadn't been sent upstairs for that paperwork, I don't know when anybody would have found him.